Jake tightened his grip on the control panel as the ship shook violently beneath his hands. The warning lights blinked red, casting a hellish glow inside the cramped cockpit. The ice-cold, mechanical voice echoed through the cabin. Warning. Hull integrity at 32%. Critical failure imminent. Yeah, no kidding, Jake growled, trying to steady the ship's trajectory. Outside the viewport, a swirling mass of green and blue lights pulsed unnaturally. A gravitational anomaly, something that shouldn't even exist in this sector, was dragging his ship toward it. Diverting power to thrusters, Jake said through gritted teeth. Sparks flew from the console as the thrusters roared to life, but the ship barely responded. Power levels dropping. Come on. Jake slammed his fist on the panel, sweat dripping down his forehead. His heart pounded painfully in his chest. Through the viewport, he saw it, a planet shrouded in dark clouds, flashes of violet lightning streaking through the atmosphere. He was going down. Fast. Prepare for emergency landing. Collision imminent. Estimated survival probability. 14%. Jake laughed bitterly. Guess I'd beaten worse odds. The ship shuddered as it broke through the planet's atmosphere. Plasma fire streaked across the hull as the ship heated up. Jake's fingers danced over the controls, stabilizing the descent as much as he could. The ground was approaching fast, a dark jungle of twisted alien foliage. Jake braced himself as the ship smashed through the treetops. The metal screeched as it was torn apart. Jake was thrown violently against his harness. A massive tree branch speared through the side of the ship, barely missing his head. Alarms screamed. The viewport cracked. The ship crashed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The world exploded into noise and darkness. Jake's eyes fluttered open. Pain shot through his body. Blood trickled down his forehead, and his left arm throbbed with a sharp, burning pain. His harness had snapped, and he was half slumped against the cockpit wall. Smoke filled the cabin. The smell of burnt metal and ozone stung his nose. Status report. Core systems damaged. Life support at 18%. Structural integrity failing. Jake cursed under his breath and forced himself to sit up. His vision swam. Through the cracked viewport, he saw the dark outline of alien trees swaying in the wind. The planet's gravity was heavier than Earth's, but manageable. A sound echoed through the wreckage. Soft, a shuffle of movement. Jake's heart raced. He reached for his sidearm, an old plasma pistol strapped to his thigh. The sound came again, closer this time. Jake pulled himself toward the emergency hatch and forced it open with a grinding screech of metal. The outside air was thick and humid. Purple-tinted mist curled around his legs as he stepped onto the soft ground. Giant twisted trees rose above him, their bark black and shining under the faint glow of two distant moons. Jake heard a soft whisper of movement again. His eyes narrowed. He raised the pistol and aimed toward the trees. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the mist. Tall, slender, and eerily graceful. Their skin shimmered under the moonlight, a pearlescent hue shifting between shades of blue and silver. Their eyes glowed faintly, cat-like slits that reflected the dim light. Jake took a step back, his finger tightening on the trigger. Stay back. One of them stepped forward, a female. Her long white hair flowed behind her, as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her body was wrapped in form-fitting, iridescent material that pulsed faintly with bioluminescence. Her eyes, an unnatural shade of violet, studied Jake with a calm, almost curious expression. Jake's mouth went dry. Who are you? The woman tilted her head. Her lips parted, and a soft, melodic sound emerged. Alien words that Jake couldn't understand. But her tone was gentle, reassuring. The others stepped closer. There were more of them now, at least 20, all female. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, like predators circling prey. Jake's hand trembled on the pistol. I'm serious. Stay back. The lead woman extended a hand toward him, her slender fingers glowing faintly at the tips. Jake's instincts screamed to run, but something about her gaze held him in place. A sound ripped through the forest, a low mechanical hum, followed by the sharp whine of energy weapons charging. The alien women stiffened. The leader's eyes narrowed. Jake turned and saw dark shapes emerging from the tree line. Hulking machines with insect-like bodies and glowing red optics. Zoreth drones. Jake's pulse spiked. Shit, get down. A blast of blue energy erupted from the nearest drone. Jake tackled the lead alien woman to the ground just as the blast streaked over them, scorching the tree behind them. The other alien women scattered. The drones advanced, energy weapons firing in rapid bursts. Jake rolled to his feet and fired his plasma pistol. The shot struck one drone in the head, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Jake spun as a second drone lunged at him. He fired again, direct hit to the core. The drone exploded, but there were too many of them. Jake's pistol hummed as the energy cell drained. A drone leaped toward him. Jake threw up his arm to block the attack. And the lead alien woman moved like lightning. She slammed her hand into the drone's head. A pulse of violet energy erupted from her palm. The drone's body seized, twitched, and collapsed to the ground. Jake stared in shock. The woman's eyes glowed brighter. She turned toward him and extended her hand again. Jake hesitated, then grabbed it. She pulled him to his feet with surprising strength. The drones began to regroup. The alien woman's gaze sharpened. She spoke again, soft but commanding. Jake didn't understand the words, but the urgency was clear. "Okay," Jake said breathlessly. "Lead the way." The alien woman's hand tightened around his. She pulled him toward the trees as the other women regrouped around them. The drones began to give chase. Jake fired behind them as they ran through the misty forest. His heart pounded wildly. He didn't know who these alien women were or why they were helping him. But right now, they were his only shot at survival. Jake's breath burned in his lungs as he sprinted through the dense forest, his hand still tightly held by the alien woman. The violet glow from her skin pulsed faintly in the dim light, casting soft shadows against the twisted trunks of alien trees. His boots slipped on the wet ground, and he nearly stumbled, but her grip on his hand steadied him. Blaster fire erupted behind them, lighting up the dark forest with bursts of crimson. The Zoreth drones were relentless, their mechanical bodies crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. Jake turned and fired a quick shot from his plasma pistol. The bolt of energy struck one drone in the head, making it collapse in a sparking heap. Another drone lunged forward. Jake aimed, but the lead alien woman stepped between him and the drone. She raised her hand, and a pulse of violet energy shot from her palm, slamming into the drone's chest. The machine exploded in a flash of white light, scattering debris across the forest floor. Jake's eyes widened. How did you do that?" he gasped, trying to catch his breath. The woman didn't answer. She turned her glowing eyes toward him and pulled him forward. The other alien women flanked them, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Jake had no idea how they communicated. None of them were speaking, but they moved together with a strange, synchronized precision. The ground beneath his feet suddenly sloped downward. The woman led him toward a cluster of jagged rocks, where a hidden entrance blended almost perfectly with the stone. She pressed her hand to the surface, and a glowing symbol appeared beneath her palm. With a low rumble, the rock shifted aside, revealing the dark tunnel. Jake hesitated, glancing back toward the forest. He could still hear the sound of the drones moving through the trees. They didn't have much time. The woman's hand squeezed his. Her eyes met his, calm but firm. Without a word, she pulled him into the tunnel. The rock slid shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. Soft bioluminescent light bloomed along the tunnel walls, illuminating the path ahead. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he followed the woman deeper into the tunnel. The other alien women followed silently behind them. Jake counted at least 20 of them. each one eerily beautiful, their movements fluid and controlled. After a few minutes, the tunnel opened into a wide cavern. A strange, crystalline structure rose in the center, pulsing with soft blue light. The walls were covered in delicate vines that shimmered faintly, almost like fiber optic cables. Jake's eyes scanned the space, noting the worn metal plates on the floor and the remnants of ancient machinery embedded in the walls. "This is a ship," Jake muttered. Or was a ship. The alien woman turned toward him. Slowly, she released his hand. She touched her chest and spoke, her voice soft and melodic. Jake couldn't understand the words, but her tone was careful, measured. She seemed to be introducing herself. "I don't understand," Jake said, shaking his head. The woman's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer and touched his forehead lightly with her fingertips. Jake tensed, but then his mind exploded with light. Images flashed across his vision. Alien worlds, shimmering oceans, skies filled with strange stars. He saw the alien woman standing among her people, saw them hunted, enslaved, then fleeing. The Zoreth, ruthless conquerors, machines without mercy. Jake stumbled back, gasping. "You're running from them." The woman's glowing violet eyes softened. She nodded. Jake rubbed his forehead. "And now, they're hunting me too." Another alien woman stepped forward. She was taller than the leader, her dark hair falling down her back in shimmering waves. She spoke in a sharp, clipped tone, accusatory. Jake raised his hands. "Whoa, if you're blaming me for this, that's not fair. I didn't ask to crash land on your planet." The lead woman raised her hand, and the other one fell silent. Her gaze lingered on Jake for a moment longer before she stepped toward the crystalline structure in the center of the room. She placed her hand against its surface. The blue light pulsed brighter. The alien language filled the air, soft whispers, almost musical. A holographic map flickered to life above the structure. Jake's eyes widened. It showed the planet's surface, and the swarm of red dots that represented the Zoreth drones moving toward their position. "They're tracking my ship's signal," Jake realized. He sighed. "Of course they are." He turned toward the lead woman. "We need to shut down the signal before they find us." The woman's gaze hardened. She spoke a single word. Jake didn't understand it, but the intention was clear. "How?" he asked. She gestured toward the far side of the cavern, where a broken panel lay half-buried beneath rubble. Jake moved toward it and knelt beside it. His fingers brushed over the panel's surface, wiping away the dust and debris. "Looks like old Terran tech," he muttered. "I can probably reroute the signal if I—" A sharp hiss sounded behind him. Jake spun, plasma pistol raised. The alien woman's eyes widened. Too late. The rock wall exploded inward in a spray of debris. Zoreth drones stormed through the opening. Jake fired his pistol, striking the first drone in the chest. Sparks erupted from the impact, but the drone kept coming. Jake rolled aside as another drone lunged toward him. He fired again, direct hit to the core. The drone collapsed, but more were coming. "Cover me," Jake shouted. The lead woman raised her hands, her eyes glowing brightly. Bolts of violet energy erupted from her fingertips, striking the drones and sending them crashing to the ground. The other alien women joined her, their hands crackling with power as they attacked the drones. Jake crouched over the control panel. Wires sparked beneath his fingers as he pulled the panel open. His hands moved automatically, bypassing damaged circuits, reconfiguring the signal output. A drone charged toward him. Jake saw it at the last second. The lead woman appeared in front of him. Her hand shot out. A pulse of violet energy erupted from her palm. The drone's head exploded in a shower of sparks. Jake grinned. "Thanks." She didn't smile, but there was a glint of amusement in her eyes. Jake turned back to the panel. His fingers flew over the console. A warning flashed across the screen. "Come on, come on." The signal spiked. The drones paused mid-attack. The lead drone's eyes flickered. Jake punched the final command. The signal cut out. The drones twitched, then collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Jake slumped back against the wall, breathing hard. His hand brushed over his forehead. The lead woman knelt beside him, her eyes searching his face. Her hand touched his cheek lightly. A strange warmth spread through him at the contact. "You okay?" Jake asked softly. Her eyes softened. She nodded. Jake smiled faintly. "Well, I guess that's one problem solved." The alien woman's gaze darkened. She glanced toward the fallen drones. Her hand tightened on Jake's arm. He frowned. "What?" The blue light from the crystal pulsed rapidly. A new wave of red dots appeared on the holographic map. Hundreds of them. Jake's stomach dropped. "They know we're here," he whispered. Jake stared at the glowing red dots on the holographic map. They were multiplying, spreading across the map like a disease. Hundreds of them. Zorath drones, closing in fast. His heart pounded. He rubbed the back of his neck, forcing himself to stay calm. "They know where we are," Jake said. "And they're coming." The lead alien woman's glowing violet eyes narrowed. She turned toward the others, and though Jake couldn't understand their language, he could feel the tension radiating through the group. The taller alien woman who had been suspicious of him earlier stepped forward and said something sharp and fast. Jake could tell by her tone that it wasn't good. Jake sighed. "Yeah, I'm guessing we don't have a lot of time." The lead woman touched the holographic map with her palm. The display zoomed in, showing the tunnels beneath the surface. Jake frowned. "Are there any defenses left in this place?" She hesitated, then moved her hand toward the lower part of the map. A faint glow highlighted a cluster of shapes beneath the main cavern. Jake's eyes widened. "Weapons." She nodded. Jake grinned. "Now we're talking." The taller woman stepped forward, her arms crossed over her chest. She said something to the lead woman in a sharp tone. Jake didn't need a translator to figure out what she was saying. Jake sighed. "She doesn't trust me." The lead woman's gaze softened. She glanced at Jake, then said something back to the taller woman. Whatever it wasn't up for discussion. The taller woman's mouth tightened, but she gave a curt nod and stepped back. Jake ran his hand through his hair. "All right, let's get to work." They moved through the lower tunnels quickly. Jake counted at least 18 alien women following them. Despite their delicate appearance, they moved like soldiers, disciplined and precise. The lead woman stayed close to Jake, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They reached a large chamber deep beneath the main cavern. Jake's breath caught as he stepped inside. Lining the walls were rows of alien weapons, energy rifles, grenades and devices Jake couldn't even begin to identify. The room had the feel of an old armory, long abandoned but still functional. Jake moved toward the nearest energy rifle. He brushed his hand over the smooth surface, noting the strange, pulsing symbols along the side. "Are these still working?" The lead woman nodded. She moved toward the wall and placed her hand against a control panel. A low hum filled the room as the weapons activated, glowing with soft blue light. Jake picked up one of the rifles. It was light but well balanced. He aimed it at the wall and squeezed the trigger. A beam of concentrated energy shot across the room, leaving a scorch mark on the far wall. "Nice," Jake muttered. He turned toward the others. "All right, everyone arm up." The alien women moved toward the weapons without hesitation. Jake watched as they selected rifles and grenades, checking them with practiced efficiency. He was starting to get the feeling that these women weren't just refugees. They were fighters. The lead woman moved toward Jake and handed him a small device. It was smooth and metallic, glowing faintly with blue light. Jake frowned. "What's this?" She placed it against his chest. A pulse of energy spread through his body, and Jake gasped as a shimmering field of light spread over his body. "A shield." She nodded. Jake grinned. "You're full of surprises." A sudden tremor ran through the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. Jake's grin faded. He turned toward the lead woman. "They're here," he said. The lead woman's eyes hardened. She turned toward the others and spoke in a sharp, commanding tone. The other women straightened and moved toward the tunnel entrance. Jake's hands tightened around the rifle. His pulse was racing, but his mind was calm. He had been in combat before. He knew how to handle himself in a fight. "All right," he said. "Here's the plan. We hold them at the choke points. We use the tunnels to limit their numbers. If they break through—" He hesitated, his eyes meeting the lead woman's. "We don't let them take us alive." She nodded, her gaze steady. Jake moved toward the tunnel entrance. The sound of metal feet scraping against stone echoed from the distance. A faint crimson glow illuminated the tunnel. Jake raised his rifle. Positions. The alien women moved quickly, taking cover behind the stone walls. Jake crouched low, his rifle aimed down the tunnel. The red glow intensified. The sound of marching feet grew louder. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. Here they come. The first drone emerged from the tunnel in a blur of metal and glowing red light. Jake fired. The energy beam struck the drone's head, blowing it apart in a shower of sparks. The next drone charged forward, raising a plasma weapon. A bolt of violet energy shot past Jake's shoulder and struck the drone's core. It collapsed. Jake glanced at the lead woman. "Nice shot." She gave him a faint smile. More drones stormed through the tunnel. Jake fired rapidly, dropping one after another. The alien women flanked him, their energy rifles firing in synchronized bursts. The drone's red eyes flickered as they collapsed under the combined assault. "Hold the line," Jake shouted. A massive drone emerged from the tunnel. Its armored body glowed with pulsing red light. Jake fired, but the beam barely dented the armor. "Shit," Jake muttered. The lead woman stepped forward. Her hands glowed with violet energy. She raised them above her head, and a wave of crackling energy shot toward the drone. The blast struck the drone's core. The machine shuddered, but didn't fall. The drone raised its weapon. Jake lunged forward. He tackled the lead woman to the ground just as the drone fired. The plasma bolt exploded against the wall, sending a shower of debris raining down. Jake rolled to his feet and fired his rifle directly into the drone's face. The drone's head exploded in a burst of red light. Jake pulled the lead woman to her feet. "You all right?" She nodded, breathing hard. Jake's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the tunnel. More drones were coming. "Too many. We need to fall back," Jake said. The lead woman shook her head. Her glowing eyes met his. Jake's breath caught. "No, we can't hold this position." She reached toward the glowing device on her wrist. Jake frowned. "What are you doing?" She pressed the device. A low rumble filled the air. The ground beneath them shuddered. Jake's eyes widened. Oh, hell. The tunnels behind them began to collapse. Jake's heart hammered. He grabbed the lead woman's arm. "We have to go." The alien women moved back toward the central cavern. Jake fired a few more shots down the tunnel, covering their retreat. A massive section of the tunnel ceiling collapsed, crushing the advancing drones beneath tons of rock. Jake stumbled into the cavern, breathing hard. The lead woman stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You just buried half the damn tunnels," Jake said, grinning. The lead woman's lips curved into a faint smile. Jake's smile faded as he glanced at the map. The red dots were still multiplying. "That's not going to stop them," Jake said. "They'll keep coming." The lead woman's eyes hardened. She turned toward the others and spoke in a sharp tone. The alien women straightened. Jake saw determination in their glowing eyes. Jake nodded. "All right," he said. "We fight." Jake sat on the edge of the stone platform, his rifle resting on his knees. The low hum of the holographic map filled the air, the red dots on the display pulsing steadily. They had bought themselves some time by collapsing the tunnels, but the Zorath weren't giving up. More drones were regrouping, forming a blockade around the perimeter. Jake knew they were planning something bigger. The lead alien woman, the one Jake had started calling Lyra in his head, stood beside him. Her violet eyes glowed softly in the dim light. She pointed at the map, her slender finger tracing a path through the collapsed tunnels. Jake frowned. "You want to attack them?" Jake asked. Lyra nodded. Jake sighed. "You've got to be kidding me." Lyra's gaze hardened. She touched the side of the map, and a smaller hologram appeared, a structure deep beneath the Zoreth's forward position. It pulsed with red light. Jake's eyes narrowed. "Their command center." Lyra nodded. Jake rubbed his chin. "You're telling me if we hit this thing, we could knock out their whole operation?" Lyra touched the map again, and the image zoomed in. A swirling mass of energy surrounded the structure, a shield. Jake sighed. Of course it couldn't be that easy. Jake leaned back, letting out a breath. "All right, let me guess. You know how to get past the shield." Lyra hesitated, then slowly shook her head. Jake smiled grimly. "Figures." Lyra's expression softened. She touched Jake's hand lightly, her skin warm against his. Jake's breath caught. He was starting to feel a connection with her, something deeper than just survival. He shook his head and forced himself to focus. Jake stood up. "All right, here's the plan. We need a diversion, something to draw their attention away from the shield long enough for me to slip inside and take out the command center." Lyra's eyes widened. She shook her head, speaking quickly in her melodic alien language. Jake sighed. "It's gotta be me. I'm the only one they won't be expecting." Lyra's jaw tightened. She stepped closer, placing her hand on Jake's chest. Her glowing eyes searched his face. Jake's chest tightened. "I'll be fine," Jake said softly. Lyra didn't look convinced. Jake turned toward the others. The alien women stood silently behind Lyra, their expressions calm but resolute. The taller woman with silver markings on her skin stepped forward. She spoke sharply, glancing at Jake. Jake chuckled. "Yeah, I know. You still don't trust me." The woman's eyes narrowed. Jake smiled. "Guess I'll just have to prove you wrong." Jake grabbed his rifle and checked the charge. "All right, let's make some noise." The alien women spread out through the cavern. Jake crouched near the tunnel entrance, rifle raised. Lyra moved beside him, her eyes glowing softly in the dim light. Jake's heart hammered as the red glow of the Zoreth drones lit up the tunnel ahead. Jake took a breath. 3, 2, 1, go. Lyra raised her hands. A blast of violet energy shot down the tunnel, striking the first wave of drones. Metal bodies exploded in a burst of sparks and smoke. Jake fired his rifle, dropping the remaining drones with precise shots. The taller alien woman darted past Jake, leaping into the air and firing twin energy bolts from her hands. The drones collapsed beneath the assault. Jake grinned. Not bad. They pushed forward into the tunnel, moving fast. The Zoreth drones regrouped, opening fire. Plasma bolts scorched the stone walls. Jake ducked behind a fallen pillar and returned fire. A drone's head exploded in a shower of sparks. Lyra stood beside Jake, her hands glowing. She raised them above her head and sent a wave of energy down the tunnel. The ground trembled as the energy pulse ripped through the Zoreth ranks, sending drones crashing into the walls. Jake smiled. "Show off." They reached the edge of the tunnel. Beyond it, the Zoreth command center pulsed with crimson light. Massive spires of black metal stretched toward the ceiling, crackling with energy. A shimmering energy shield surrounded the central core. Jake's gaze hardened. "All right, time to get to work." Lyra grabbed his arm. Jake turned toward her. Her glowing eyes were wide with concern. "I'll be fine," Jake said. Lyra hesitated, then leaned closer and pressed her forehead against his. Jake's breath caught. He placed his hand on her cheek, his thumb brushing against her soft skin. "I'll come back," Jake whispered. He turned and slipped through the shadows, staying low. The shield flickered ahead of him, pulsing with rhythmic energy. Jake narrowed his eyes, studying the pattern. He touched the small device Lyra had given him earlier and activated it. A low hum filled the air as a faint shimmer of energy surrounded his body. Jake stepped toward the shield. It pulsed brighter, sensing his approach. Jake took a breath and moved closer. The shield buzzed and crackled, but didn't repel them. Jake's eyes widened. "Well, that's interesting," he muttered. He stepped through the shield. It rippled around him, but let him pass. Jake crouched low as he approached the command center. The massive core throbbed with crimson light. Jake raised his rifle, aiming for the core's center. His finger tightened on the trigger. A sound behind him made him freeze. Jake spun around. A massive Zorith drone towered over him, its red eyes glowing with menace. The drone's arm unfolded, revealing a crackling plasma cannon. Jake fired. The shot struck the drone's chest, but barely made a dent. "Shit," Jake muttered. The drone lunged. Jake rolled to the side as the plasma cannon fired. The blast exploded against the far wall, sending shards of metal flying through the air. Jake crouched and fired again, aiming for the drone's head. The beam scorched the side of its helmet. The drone charged. Jake threw himself backward as the drone's arm crashed into the floor, leaving a crater where he'd just been standing. Jake fired his rifle repeatedly, backing toward the core. His back hit the control panel. He glanced at the screen. A series of symbols glowed across the display. Jake's gaze narrowed. "All right," Jake muttered. "Time for a gamble." He slammed his hand against the control panel. A loud hum filled the room as the core's red glow intensified. Jake grinned. "Come on. Blow, you bastard." The drone raised its cannon. Jake closed his eyes. A blinding flash filled the chamber. The drone's head exploded in a burst of white-hot energy. Jake opened his eyes to see Lyra standing in the doorway, her hands crackling with violet light. Jake grinned. "Took you long enough." Lyra ran toward him. Jake reached for her hand and pulled her close. The command center's core pulsed dangerously. Jake's eyes widened. "We need to go. Now." They ran toward the exit as the core's energy spiked. Jake dove through the shield just as the core exploded behind him. A wave of energy rushed through the tunnel, shaking the walls. Jake stumbled to his feet as debris rained down around them. Lyra pulled him to his feet. The alien women stood nearby, weapons raised. The taller woman's eyes widened as the Zorith drones powered down and collapsed. Jake grinned. "Guess we hit the right spot." Lyra stepped toward him. Jake met her gaze. "Nice timing," Jake said. Lyra smiled faintly. Jake's grin faded as he glanced at the map. More red dots were appearing. "They're not done yet," Jake said. "But neither are we." Lyra's eyes narrowed. The alien women moved into formation behind her. Jake's pulse quickened. "All right," Jake said. "Let's finish this." Jake stood at the edge of the platform, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The dim red light from the holographic map flickered across his face. More red dots were appearing on the display, clustering together in tight, coordinated formations. The Zorith weren't giving up. If anything, they were regrouping for a larger, more concentrated attack. Lyra stood beside him, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The other alien women formed a line behind her, their shimmering weapons raised and ready. The taller woman with silver markings stepped forward, speaking quickly in her alien language. Lyra nodded once. Jake took a breath. "They're coming," he said. Lyra's eyes sharpened. Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. The way her hands flexed at her sides told him how serious this was. He placed a hand on her arm. "We'll stop them," Jake said. Lyra's eyes softened for a moment, but then she stepped back and turned toward the others. She raised her hand, and the alien women fell into position. Jake watched as the platform's defensive barriers began to rise, humming with energy. He checked his rifle's charge. Half power. It would have to be enough. A low rumble shook the cavern. Jake's eyes narrowed. A dark shape moved through the shadows of the tunnel. Then another. The red glow of Zorath eyes cut through the darkness. "They're here," Jake whispered. A sharp mechanical shriek echoed through the cavern as the first wave of drones surged forward. Plasma bolts filled the air. Jake ducked behind a fallen pillar and returned fire. His shot struck the lead drone in the head, and it crumpled to the ground. Lyra raised her hands, and a wave of violet energy pulsed through the cavern. Drones were thrown backward, smashing against the walls. The taller alien woman dashed forward, her twin energy blades slicing through the air. Drones collapsed beneath her assault. Jake jumped over the pillar and fired his rifle, dropping another drone. He spun as a larger drone lunged toward him, its plasma cannon charging. Jake dove to the side as the blast scorched the ground where he just stood. He rolled to his feet and fired 2 quick shots. The drone's head exploded in a burst of sparks. "They're pushing hard," Jake shouted. The ground trembled beneath his feet. A deep metallic sound filled the air. Jake's eyes widened as the wall at the far end of the cavern split open. A massive Zorath walker emerged, its spindly legs clicking against the stone floor. Its glowing red core pulsed with deadly energy. Jake cursed. "That's new." The walker's plasma cannons rotated toward them. Jake grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her down as a blast of energy tore through the platform. Debris rained down around them. Jake coughed and pulled himself upright. "Any ideas?" Jake asked. Lyra's glowing eyes flicked toward the walker's core. She gestured toward the ceiling. Jake followed her gaze. A cluster of massive stalactites hung above the walker. Jake grinned. "All right, I see where you're going with this." Jake turned toward the taller alien woman. "Cover us." She nodded and leaped into action, leading the others into a coordinated assault. Bright streaks of energy bolts lit up the cavern as they fired in unison, focusing on the walker's legs. The massive machine stumbled, its balance shifting. Jake climbed the side of the cavern wall, his boots digging into the stone. He reached the overhanging ledge above the walker and pulled out a plasma grenade. The walker's red core pulsed, preparing to fire. "Come on," Jake muttered. "Look at me." The walker's massive head rotated toward him. Jake smiled grimly and pulled the pin. He tossed the grenade toward the stalactites. The explosion rocked the cavern. The stalactites cracked and broke free, crashing down onto the walker's core. The machine's red light flickered and died as the spires of stone smashed through its body. The walker collapsed in a heap of smoking metal. Jake slid down the side of the cavern wall, landing hard. He rolled to his feet as Lyra ran toward him. Her hands gripped his arms, her eyes wide with concern. "I'm good," Jake said, wincing. "Mostly." Lyra's hand brushed his cheek, her expression soft. The cavern trembled again. Jake's head snapped toward the tunnel as more red lights appeared in the darkness. Drones poured into the cavern, hundreds of them. Jake's stomach dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." Lyra's expression hardened. The alien women regrouped around her. Jake stepped in front of them. His rifle hummed as he charged it. "We're not getting out of this," Jake said. Lyra reached for his hand. Jake squeezed it tightly. "All right," Jake said. "Let's give them hell." The drones charged. Jake fired, cutting down the front line. Lyra raised her hands, and a wave of violet energy shot through the swarm, tearing drones apart. The taller alien woman darted between the drones, her blades flashing. Sparks and shattered metal littered the ground. Jake's rifle overheated. He cursed and switched to his sidearm. He fired repeatedly, taking down drones one by one. A plasma bolt struck his shoulder, and Jake stumbled back. Lyra pulled him up. Her eyes flashed with rage. She stepped forward, and her whole body began to glow. The air around her shimmered as energy crackled from her hands. A pulse of violet light surged outward, striking the entire swarm. The drones froze, then exploded in a cascade of sparks and fire. Jake shielded his eyes from the blast. When he opened them, the cavern was quiet. Smoke drifted through the air. The ground was littered with the broken bodies of the Zorath drones. Lyra staggered, Jake caught her as she collapsed against him. "I got you," Jake whispered. Lyra's glowing eyes flicked toward the far end of the cavern. A single figure emerged from the smoke, a Zorath general. Its massive armored form gleamed in the dim light. Its red eyes pulsed with menace. Jake tightened his grip on his weapon. "Seriously." The general raised a massive energy blade. Jake stepped in front of Lyra, his weapon aimed. "Stay behind me," Jake said. Lyra shook her head. She struggled to her feet, her glowing hands trembling. The Zorath general lunged. Jake fired. The shot struck the general's armor and ricocheted off harmlessly. Jake ducked as the massive blade sliced through the air, narrowly missing his head. Lyra raised her hands. A blast of violet energy struck the general, staggering it. Jake jumped forward and fired his sidearm point-blank into the general's head. The armor cracked, but the general swung its blade toward Jake's chest. Jake rolled aside at the last moment. He raised his rifle, but the general's blade knocked it from his hands. Jake reached for his last grenade. The general's blade plunged toward his chest. Lyra screamed, and the ground beneath them exploded in a burst of violet light. The general stumbled, its armor cracking. Jake seized the moment. He lunged forward and jammed the grenade beneath the cracks in the armor. "Say goodnight," Jake growled. The grenade exploded. The general's head shattered, and its massive form collapsed to the ground. Jake sat up, gasping for breath. Lyra knelt beside him, her glowing eyes wide with concern. Jake smiled weakly. "We win?" Jake whispered. Lyra leaned closer and brushed her forehead against his. Jake smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." "Lyra," Jake shouted. Lyra's gaze turned toward him. Tears shimmered in her glowing eyes. Her lips curved into a small smile. The core pulsed one final time. Lyra's light flared. Then the entire cavern exploded. The shockwave tore through the tunnel. Jake was thrown backward. He struck the ground hard. His breath knocked from his lungs. The tunnel ceiling collapsed behind him, sealing the cavern. Jake scrambled to his feet, coughing. The taller alien woman grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the surface. Jake stumbled out into the cold air, collapsing to his knees. Behind him, the mountain rumbled. A massive plume of smoke and fire erupted from the collapsed cavern. Jake stared at the destruction, his chest heaving. His hands trembled. He felt hollow, empty. Lyra was gone. The taller alien woman knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jake's eyes burned, but he forced himself to breathe. He couldn't fall apart now. Lyra had given her life so they could survive. He couldn't let that be in vain. Jake pulled himself to his feet. He turned toward the others. The alien women stood silently, their expressions somber. Jake lifted his rifle. "We're not done," Jake said. His voice was steady. The taller alien woman nodded. Jake's jaw tightened. His heart ached, but he pushed the pain aside. There would be time to grieve later. Right now, there was still a war to finish. Jake took one last look at the burning mountain. He whispered her name under his breath. Then he turned toward the battlefield and walked into the dark.